Hello and welcome everyone to Grandparents Raising Grandchildren. We are going to get started in about 1 minute. We'll start at 1:01 Eastern Standard Time. If you have any questions about grandparents raising grandchildren before we get started, feel free to drop those in the chat box. It is a public chat today, so any questions that you submit, everyone will see. You can say hi to everybody in the chat box. You can introduce yourself and where you are working from, what state you're in, all that good stuff. But we'll get started in about 30 seconds. Let's see who's here. Hi, Jenny. Hi, Carrie. Welcome. Melissa, you're new to us. Thank you so much for joining us, Melissa. Steve, Terry. Terry, I don't think you've come to any of our sessions before. Welcome, welcome. All right. Okay, it is 1:01 Eastern Standard Time, so just to respect everybody's time, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Marie Gress. I'm a licensed master level social worker with specialties in macro practice, older adults, and user experience. I am so excited today. My intern is here to tell you about grandparents raising grandchildren. Kristina is a BSW candidate at Eastern Michigan University. I take interns from all around the country, and I'm excited that she's just in my backyard here in Michigan. Yeah, if there's any questions that you have while we get started, Kristina, if you could go ahead and turn on your camera and microphone so everyone can see you. As you submit questions, I'm going to be watching for those, and when Kristina is done sharing this information today, we have a number of handouts for you. I'll ask your questions so she doesn't have to manage all of the things. And yeah, Kristina, tell us a little bit about you and what you've been working on this semester, and take us through what you have.
Hi, so I'm Kristina. I am a bachelor's level social work student at Eastern Michigan, as Marie already said. I've been interning with Kovir Page with Marie for this winter semester, and I've been working on grandparents raising grandchildren. I've been doing a lot of research and just looking into the best way to service grandparents raising their grandchildren, both under legal custody and without legal custody. This specific presentation is going to be geared towards grandparents who do have legal either custody or legal care of their children, even if it's temporary. So this is the data from 2020 for Michigan. As you can see, 185,926 children are living in homes where a relative is head of household. Of those, 54,000 children are being raised by a kin with no parent present. So a kin would be a family member who is caring for them that is not the biological father or mother of the child. And of those, 4,675 children are in the foster care system being raised by kin, which means that their caregiver who is related to them has legal temporary custody of them, but the foster care system holds the actual legal custody, makes legal decision towards when and where they go and who they live with, and if parentals will get their rights back to having them in their home. It also, you can see it says for every one child raised by a kin in foster care, there are 12 being raised by kin outside of foster care. That kind of just means that for every one in the foster care system, there's going to be 12 being raised by a family member, either without any legal action where it kind of just happened, or with legal action where they may have actual legal custody.
Research you found some data across the country, and you found this 1 and 12 number was pretty accurate across the country, right?
Yes.
Wow, that's incredible.
So custodial grandparents usually have a parental role with both their own children and their grandchildren. So it gives them sometimes an advantage or disadvantage depending on the situation. Often the biological parent may or may not be in the home. The grandparents could have care of the grandchildren even with a biological parent in the home because the biological parent is not um, in the right place to be caring for the child at the time. The grandparents could become parents of the grandchildren because of the emotional and or physical loss of one or both biological parents. And the grandparent grandchild relationship may or may not consist of a legal relationship. As I mentioned earlier, it's often found that grandparents are raising their grandchildren without any legal action taken, where it they just did it made a decision within the family because the parent was unable to care for them, or it happened over time and maybe they didn't even realize that they were fully caring for their grandchildren. So these are some of the reasons that parents cannot provide care for their children. These are just some of the reasons. There are probably a million and one reasons that come up, and every family's different. But some of the most common reasons are divorce, substance abuse, family violence, teenage parenthood, child abuse and neglect, poverty, parental abandonment, terminal illness, death, incarceration, mental health, and parental military service. So challenges that are often found with grandparents raising their grandchildren include resentment towards their grandchildren and their children. They kind of were done parenting. They kind of thought they were done parenting. Maybe they were going and starting a different part of their life, and now they're back parenting again, and maybe they're missing out on things they thought they would be doing. Disappointment in their children is often found, and they often feel they didn't raise their children to be the kind of parent that couldn't care for their child, and so they feel disappointment towards their child. Depression and isolation also often comes with the change in social roles because they may have had a very active social life prior to having to take care of their grandchildren, and then with all the responsibility of their grandchildren, they kind of change their social roles and maybe don't get to go out and see maybe their friends or their other family as often. Financial issues and housing concerns, those come with having more to take care of than maybe just themselves and their spouse. They now have the financial burden of the children and the housing. Maybe their house was a one-bedroom condo and now they have 3 of their grandchildren and they have to find somewhere where it's suitable for all of them to live. They also have the generational differences, the legal issues, and the marital issues.
Support groups while you were doing this research for us. What were you hearing from the grandparents as things that they were actively struggling with from this list?
Um, Almost everything on this list was mentioned. Specifically, most of them were at a point where they were past the resentment and disappointment stages of it, but they mentioned that like in the beginning there was a huge part that they struggled with. The change in social roles was mentioned multiple times by multiple different grandparents, how like they are parenting children who are they're now going to parent teacher conferences and they're around their grandchildren's friends' parents who are the same age as their children, and that's where the generational differences would come in, oftentimes with the way that maybe the grandchildren were seeing their friends be raised by their parents versus their grandparent raised them different because of generational differences. The biggest one that I felt was mentioned a lot, and they didn't seem to have felt they had much understanding for was the marital issues that came with taking in their grandchildren.
I can definitely see that based on the grandparents raising grandchildren groups that I've led. They often bring up their spouse, but all of these conversations are so centered on the grandchildren and centered on like the legal issues happening that they don't spend as much time on working through their marital relationship anymore. We were curious, out of all of you who are here, how many of you know a grandparent raising a grandchild? I have a poll that I just put up there for you guys to answer. And then another one before we go much further is, as Kristina is talking about some of these barriers and challenges, and eventually we get to services, where do you feel like like where's your knowledge base at? You know so much, you know nothing at all. Where on that scale would you kind of put yourself based on some of the work that you've done and all of that? Okay, so do you know a grandparent raising a grandchildren? Everyone said yes. They all know somebody. For how much you know about a grandparent raising grandchildren, barriers and services, things like that. We have 17% said a 4, 67, so the most votes said a 3, and then 17% said nothing at all. So this is really good that you're talking about this stuff, Kristina. Anything else you wanted to mention on this slide before we go forward?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
So this goes into the marital issues and strains that were often brought up. In all the three grandparents raising grandchildren support groups I sat in on, there was only women in all three of them. Their spouses weren't there with them, or they didn't have a spouse or a legal spouse. And it was also often mentioned when it came to legal situations that often the grandmother was the legal guardian or the one involved in the foster care portion of it. However, the grandfather, it sounded like in most situations, actually had no legal connection to raising the grandchildren at all. And that wasn't in all situations, and that was on a small level of people, but that is just like what I experienced with them. So some of the things mentioned as strains on their marriage was jealousy between the time spent with the grandchildren versus their spouse. Often these are retired or close to retirement grandparents who spend a lot of time together, maybe vacationing or even just at home together. And they go from having all that alone time to a lot of time focused on their grandchildren and not so much time for them. So how the children are raised, same thing as really co-parenting in any married couple or any co-parent situation. I mean, everyone has different ways of raising their children or grandchildren. Something that was mentioned a lot was that the grandmothers often found that they were more lenient with their grandchildren than they were with their own children originally, and the grandfathers were just as strict as they normally were, and so they seemed to butt heads over that. And it seems that like maybe that grandmother care came into place, and they didn't want to be as hard on them. So setting limits would also be part of that. They often didn't agree on setting limits, and this caused problems within their house. Barriers to privacy. This was mentioned a lot, especially when they were caring for little grandchildren, young ones maybe under the age of 5. They went from being alone, as I mentioned before, most of the time at least, to now having little ones running in and out of their room, running in and out of everywhere. We often know little ones don't let you go to the bathroom alone. And these are things that they haven't had to deal with in maybe 20 plus years. So along with that was the decreased time for their spouse, as I already mentioned, and then the disruption in other family relationships. Often it's not agreed upon within the whole family that the grandparents take on the grandchildren of one of the children or even their only child. Often other children or grandchildren have their opinions about who should be raising those children and that their mother and father should be doing it. And so they don't necessarily support their grandparents for taking care of those children. And so it can cause strain in those other relationships and cause them to spend less time together as a whole family. So as I mentioned earlier, there's different forms of having care, the grandparents having care. Sometimes it just happens. And so that this is just for guardianship and custody, both legal situations. So the people who just kind of happens with and they never take any legal action, they don't technically have any legal right to make decisions for their grandchildren or to even seek medical care. Guardianship and custody, however, guardianship is the legal relationship in which the guardian is given daily responsibility for the child. So the child is with the guardian takes them to school, makes sure they're fed and have clothes on them, does their homework. Maybe they get to decide if they go to a friend's house or not. Versus custody is the legal relationship in which the custodian is given daily responsibility. So all those things mentioned in guardianship, as well as the right to make legal decisions concerning the child. The biggest differences with this is like the medical and financial decisions, and especially the school decisions. In guardianship, which is what often would come with a foster care situation, they actually don't get to make the decision for where the children go to school by themselves. It has to be made with either the biological parent if the foster care system's not involved, or with the foster care system, where the foster care system often pushes for the children to go in the district they're living in. Versus if it was a custodial parent and say they knew that they didn't want them in the district they're living in, they could go and take them to another district and apply for school choice without having to concern anyone else in the situation. Sorry, you can go to the next one.
For services to support grandparents.
Okay, so what was that? I'm sorry.
Did the slide change for you?
Yeah, it did.
Okay, good.
It took a minute. So the services that are often offered for grandparents raising their grandchildren, I just first want to mention again that these are services that are for grandparents in a legal situation with their grandchildren. If the grandparents are not in a legal situation with their grandchildren, there's far less support services because they cannot prove the care of having that they're caring for their grandchild. So some of the services that are often offered throughout the community or even the state or government-based programs are education support services, emotional support services, support from the school district or Head Start. So that would be often found like aftercare. I found that aftercare for school or Head Start is actually favored towards children who are being raised by another grandchild, another family member. And not necessarily favored, more so like it's kind of based on a point system. So like that kind of gives you a point towards needing it more than maybe someone who's being raised by their parent. And then of course there's other financial decisions. Financial support services, those are going to be the things found through your state or government funded programs. Often legal advocacy services, housing support services, and medical support services. Those are three are ones that you can often find on a community level and on a state and government level.
Having this holistic approach to supporting grandparents is really key because what one grandparent is going to struggle with is something that another grandparent has taken care of. And that was something that I really found leading grandparents raising grandchildren support groups was that time to talk together and to talk about common struggles, or different people were always at different stages of these things. So someone might be struggling with the school stuff. Well, oh, we did that last year and this is what worked for us. We are having trouble affording X, Y, and Z. Oh, well, did you know that in our county, if you apply for adoption, you get these additional services, and going through the legal stuff and everything like that, especially when it was a county-based support group and people could talk about the specific judges. I found for the legal advocacy stuff, just being able to know who your judge is and how to talk to your judge as a grandparent is huge. They oftentimes have had no legal experience up until this point, and having some of those supports is really, really beneficial.
So, some strengths that grandparents bring to their grandchildren that are often different than the grandchild being raised by their parent is accumulated wisdom from living experiences. Obviously, their grandparents have been alive a lot longer than them and their parents. So, they have those living experiences that they can share with their grandchildren. Maturity from the situation. Often, grandparents are raising their grandchildren who often have young parents, and the maturity of them and having already gone through parenting children can often strengthen the grandchild overall as a person and as they grow. Family history and roots. I think we all know that our parents and grandparents usually know more than us about that, and then we learn through them, and eventually we become them. An attachment figure for the grandchild and grandchildren. That comes with often the parents who aren't involved at all, and the child hasn't developed an attachment to their parent or had and lost that and are now seeking a new attachment. Positive identity and family continuity, um, and communication of unconditional love, a sense of security. A sense of security was a big one that a lot of the grandparents brought up that their grandchildren had expressed to them, often coming from homes where things weren't so great and maybe they didn't feel safe all the time, or they felt safe, but they didn't know when their parent was going to be home or when who was going to be there to care for them because their parent was working multiple jobs. And the sense of security and knowing they're safe and in the home with their grandparent and having a regular schedule, even, they're often able to give their grandchild that.
And a lot of the grandparents who were scared that their children were going to come and try and take the kids in the middle of the night really benefited from having security cameras. And there's $25 cameras that will sync to your phone if you have Wi-Fi. And they found it reassuring, and even their like 8-year-old grandchildren, they said, found it really reassuring. So just little things like that that you can keep encouraging them in is huge.
Rewards for grandparents who are raising their grandchildren are seeing their grandchildren grow at a more personal level than they would if their grandchild was not being cared for them and not in their home. an unexpected source of purpose and meaning. It was mentioned that from multiple grandparents that after the resentment stage and the disappointment stage, they started to realize that maybe if their grandchildren weren't around, they wouldn't have something to do every day, and they wouldn't have them to care for every single day. And now they feel like they have a reason to wake up every day and get motivated and get going. Having another chance at parenting, this one was brought up a lot. They felt that they could try and fix maybe things that they didn't feel they did so great the first time around. And they were able to give their grandchildren that outlook on things that they couldn't give their children because they were young and they were learning how to do it the first time, and maybe they didn't do everything as perfect as they would have hoped. Being involved in the community related to children, often grandparents who aren't regularly involved in their grandchildren's lives to begin with are not around children as often. They're around other older adults, and maybe there are other children who are also adults. And so being around children and just um, in a general level, like with their grandchildren or without their grandchildren, it just brings more to a grandparent. They get the generational differences. They get the happiness and the excitement that little kids bring to the environment, and experiencing self-renewal and adding new social networks. So as we already mentioned, like they're going to start, their social roles are changing. They're now in parent-teacher conferences. They're going to school events and football games. And so they're getting all these new networks and meeting new people that they wouldn't have otherwise been connected to. These are just a couple of the top websites I found were really helpful out of the ones I found information on, outside of the ones that are already in the handouts that we have.
Let me pass those around. There are 5 handouts I'm going to share with you guys that Kristina pulled together. The first one is some data from Michigan. There is Making It Work. This report is from 2012, but Kristina and I thought that it just had really good and helpful information, even though it's a little older than what we typically share. There's some resources that she pulled together. A Family First legal guide. One of the first things that grandparents are often bombarded with is all that legal stuff, right? And it's new, it's different, it's hard. And then also her slide deck is the last thing that I'm sharing with you. So she had a lot of really good points. And so as you are thinking about starting a grandparents raising grandchildren support group or any other services that grandparents would benefit from, looking back at her slides, just keeping in mind the holistic approach that she's taking to some of this content. So there's 5 downloads for you. If you want to go to that handout section and click through those, grab those, that would be good.
And the Grand Facts for Michigan, if you want to go ahead and download that one or just take a look at that one, that same site has a Grand Fact sheet for every state. So if you're not necessarily in Michigan, it has the website on there, and you can go ahead on there and find the same thing done for your state.
Great. And these websites that were on the previous slide, these are national resources, right?
Yes.
Yep, great. Good, good. All right. Does anyone have any questions for Kristina? Oops, I don't want to do that. I have one more question that Kristina wanted to ask. So Kristina covered for us why someone takes care of their grandchild or kin. She talked about the struggles grandparents face when they're raising their grandchildren. She talked about things that help, resources and services that help, and benefits to the grandparent and benefits to the grandchild for this relationship. All of those were pretty brief overviews, but after listening to this talk, the question is, if you could go to the polls, after listening to the talk, how confident are you that you could start serving grandparents in this capacity? How confident are you that you could start something? You have some framework, some groundwork of where to start for this. And if you're not quite sure after listening to this, if you're still feeling not terribly confident, are there any questions you have that would help you feel more confident? 67% said they feel pretty confident, a 4, and 33% gave us a 3, Kristina. Any questions? Kristina, if someone did want to start a support group, where might they find grandparents?
So, looking into that, the best place to reach out to grandparents are going to be the normal places that you expect to find um, grandparents and older age adults. So, community centers are going to be a really great place, as well as you can reach out to schools. What I found when talking to one of the social workers running one of the support groups is she said she often reaches out to the school social worker or counselor and just kind of lets them know about this, and it often gets passed along as they find more grandparents raising the grandchildren that they're helping inside the school.
Yeah, schools were always my best go-to. It always took a while to get those grandparents there from the school, but the school counselors, when they ran across them, always sent them our way. When you were going to these virtual support groups, about how many people were attending?
So one of them only had 4 people, but the other 2 were between about 8 and 12 people. And they did mention that prior to going virtual, I went to one that twice, so 2 for the same group, but more people were at one. But both people running the support groups did mention that prior to having everything go virtual, they were having large amounts, over 25 up to maybe 50.
Wow.
Grandparents in their support groups. One which they mentioned that they were originally meeting in a smaller area, and they actually reached out to their local library and started meeting there after close on the days they close early in order to have more space because they had so many people.
Wow. You mentioned that there was a group that you went to twice and there was more people at one. Do you know what drew more people to that group?
They were, as far as my understanding was, there were people who were already going before it went virtual, and their attendance kind of just fluctuates now that it's virtual. It's kind of like if they remember to go, if they have the time to get on. They also mentioned that they changed the time. The first time I went, they changed the time specifically for a specific presenter, and that was the time that only 4 people were there. So they felt that they may have had a factor in that the same grandparents weren't available at that time.
Yeah, changing the time could do that. Yeah, I always had more people attend my groups when I had a presenter come and talk, so they could ask really specific questions to that expert. Melissa asked, are you aware of any evidence-based structured grandparents raising grandchildren programs?
I actually didn't check if the ones that I put on my program, if any of them were evidence-based. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, if you could look at that, that would be great. And Melissa, I'll look at my list of evidence-based classes as well. My list is from the National Council on Aging, so more of their programs on that list are connected to exercise and caregivers, mental health, dementia, some things like that. So, but I'll look at my list and see if there was anything. I know that in a lot of states where I've done work, grandparents raising grandchildren and kinship care programs are not funded well, and so they just don't get the attention that other programs do. And if they're not getting if they're not being paid to do some of this work, it's really hard for some professionals to be pushing some of it forward. But that's a really good question. We'll look into it. Kristina, I just remembered that when you first started some of this work, you were finding some information around Indigenous groups and grandparents raising grandchildren and some of the barriers that they face there. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Sure. So I wasn't able to find too much on it. It seems to be something that needs to be addressed, but hasn't been addressed enough. So the differences between finding care for the children if the parents are unable to care for them, that process is very different. We often know that tribes are involved and they have different custody situations. So the biggest question that I had was if there's a grandparent willing to take custody outside of the tribe versus if they're in the tribe and someone who's not a direct family member wanted to take care, which one would be favored? And I couldn't find a direct answer. It kind of sounded like there would be like an investigation into the situations, and the same thing is kind of like when they make a decision on a foster care placement. They look into the situations, they decide which one's the best fit for the child. But it was something that I found. I didn't speak to anyone in any of the support groups that brought it up, but it found on a lot of different message boards and such, that it was something that they felt wasn't addressed on a legal standpoint. They felt it needed to be a legal decision that was in place so they knew what was going to happen to their grandchildren if they stayed in the tribe versus staying with them. And I wasn't unable to find like a direct answer for any of that at a federal level or at the Michigan level.
I know that some structures with grandparents raising grandchildren or grandparents as parents, sometimes it's framed differently, but with some, I'm trying to think of how to frame this question. They can get financial support from the state for taking care of this child. Like this child is technically a ward of the state because they're in the foster care system, but they're also living with the grandparent. I was wondering if you have any clarification around those financial supports that grandparents can have.
So my only understanding is the same kind of foster stipend and financial support that any foster care parent gets. So if they're a grandparent fostering their grandchildren, they are able to get any support that anyone else fostering someone who maybe isn't related to them could have.
That's good. Did you find that there were certain groups that didn't go for custody or guardianship, that they were just kind of watching their grandchildren because that's just how it happened?
It sounded to me that the most often cases of that happening wasn't maybe a specific group, but more so like a specific cause. So like the cause of that happening often sounded like substance abuse, where they didn't seek legal action because they didn't want legal action taken upon their children and the grandchild's parent. They didn't want to take away the chance of them being able to come back and get better and take care of their children. And so they often just kept it within the family, which does cause those extra strains of not being able to get the supports they need because they can't prove that they have custody or care for those children.
Interesting. Well, Kristina, any other closing thoughts? Any closing advice for these centers?
I actually just realized I forgot to put the AARP website as a national website you can use. They have a lot of good information on there. And then not only that, but they have a lot of links more specific per state that you can go through.
Great. Wonderful. All right, well, that's about it for today. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the Grandparents Raising Grandchildren. You're going to get the replay of this. If you had any trouble getting any of the handouts to download, feel free to reach out to me, and I can get those to you as well. Otherwise, we'll see you in Wisecove later.